Welcome to the RotoWire Fantasy Baseball Podcast. It's Wednesday night. I'm your host, James Anderson. We're brought to you by Fantrax. The dynasty rankings were fully updated last week up on the site. And this week I got to write about a really fun, first of its kind dynasty startup auction that I got to participate in over the span of a few weeks in January. So that's all up on the site, rotowire.com/pod, if you want to check that out. But tonight I'm going to be talking with my friend Marc Winokur. Mark's done a couple NFBC auctions already this year. I sent out the link to the pod we did last year. I thought that was just really good evergreen content for just auction strategy. But tonight we're going to get into some actual players and some guys that Mark built his two auction teams around. And then we're going to look at AAV, average auction value, versus ADP, and kind of see which players are more in demand in these first auctions than they have been so far in snake drafts. So first, Mark, thanks so much for joining me, man. I really appreciate it. How you doing?
Doing great, James. Love being on with you again. I love that we're making this an annual get together.
Yeah, man. I mean, I'll take as much auction talk with you as I can get. So yeah, you did your first auction this year. What date was your first auction of the year? I remember last year you didn't get into anything until February.
Yeah, January 24th. So I was just a week shy of making it to my February 1 start date. So I was pretty happy that I held out that long. It's really tough when you see all of your friends drafting for 3 or 4 months and you're having to just vicariously live through them, and you don't have any players on the site to look at that are yours. So it was good to finally crack the seal and get my first team.
So, you're in there, the heat of the moment. How prepared did you think you were for that first one? And how did it go relative to kind of your prep and everything?
Not very prepared. I completed a good deep dive of all the hitters, but not the pitchers. So once I get the first set of projections, so really once ATC comes out, for the most part, that comprises a good amount of my aggregate projections. Certainly not all. There's so many good projections this year. I've definitely mixed it up from previous years and have a new composite group of projections. But once ATC comes out, I can get my first set of valuations. Once I do that, I get the itch, and I have to give them a trial run. So I'm okay to jump in the first one unprepared. For my pitching, it was really more of a spreadsheet draft, really looking at what the projections are showing for pitchers and what the AAV, and building my pitching staff off that. I had some more opinions of the hitters. I was able to, of course, with my partner Mager, look at some of the deep dives he's put together for them, and that gave me a little more background for the position players. So felt a little better there. I thought it went okay. As I look at the team, because I only have 2 teams now, and like all of us players, we like to look at our teams, and I have looked at it numerous times since the auction, and it's kind of growing on me a little bit. So
of course,
I feel okay with it. There were a few guys I really wanted to get, Lindor and Matt McClain in particular. In this first one, I was able to roster them. Feel like I'm fairly balanced, maybe a little light on power in this first one, but just being back in the heat of the auction was it's very energizing. It's a rush. You have to remember, use that muscle memory on how you do auctions, making sure I have all my screens and my papers and just the flow of it. And just remembering it's a little bit of a mental test. The first one went 4 hours and 15 minutes. And you do feel like you went a few rounds in the ring after you finish those. So it's just trying to get back into auctioning shape, so to speak.
Yeah, absolutely. A lot of that rang true. I was just last night, I was going through my draft champions teams and setting the roster, setting the lineups for no reason at all. I mean, I'm going to change it 5 times between now and opening day. And then, the auctions, they take a toll on you physically, mentally. Your first one here, you built around Tariq Skubal and Francisco Lindor. And then you had Sonny Gray, Luis Castillo, Robert Suarez, kind of rounding out your big pitching buys. Matt McClain, as you mentioned, Anthony Santander, Pete Crow Armstrong, Will Smith, Ian Happ, Stephen Kwan, Matt Chapman, sort of your double-digit hitter buys. So yeah, it's a very interesting team. The one thing that jumped out to me right away was that you ended up with Luis Arraez and Stephen Kwan, and you sort of backfilled batting average almost in the auction here. And then the snake draft, obviously we often talk about getting your batting average base early, first few picks, you're definitely loading up on high batting average guys. But in the auction, you have the option of sort of knowing that you're going to buy one of these kind of one category, one and or two category type of monsters, like an Arraez and batting average, for instance, and you can sort of plan around that with your bigger purchases. So was that the fact that you ended up with those guys? Was that just the way the auction went, or was that part of the idea behind the build?
No, that was the way the auction went. I think this is the first time I have rostered Arraez in an auction. I may have had him in a snake years ago. My pre-auction plan, your pre-auction plan is I want to get a great first baseman, a great second baseman, a great, on and on. And in this one, I felt like the first base position was fairly priced up. So I ended up having to pivot to Arraez. And one thing I've tried to make a priority this year is batting average. It's been a weakness of mine for many years, and it's probably held me back from higher overall finishes in some contests. So it's something I want to pay more attention to. One of the benefits of an auction is you're not bound by the restrictions about when you can't get a category or a position. So that's, what I love about it. But I think the same general principle applies, at least with batting average. The top hitters give you the best batting average plus all the other categories. And if you don't pay up for those players, you're going to be scrambling at the back end on the Kwans or the Arraez or Chung-Ho Lees, later on to try to paper over that deficit. The challenge is the high average players are all overpriced, at least how I view them. So you have to make a determination. Am I willing to overpay for that category, or can I get my statistics elsewhere? And, when we pivot to the second auction, I could talk a little bit more how I handled that one. The issue with an Arraez and a Kwan is, my average projection looks good, but I'm a little light in power because of it. It's very hard to take two players who won't total 20 homers when you need to average 20 per player. So you're making a trade-off there. And I tried to address it a little bit at the position. I got a late Andrew Vaughn and a late Michael Busch, the two of them for $5, which I think is pretty good. I think both have, at least 20 homer power and maybe some other accounting stats. So, and the good thing with the Arraez is he has second base eligibility. So I'm not necessarily tied to him at the first base position. I could do some maneuvering there, and maybe I don't lose as much from the power standpoint from having a first baseman like him.
Yeah, it does seem certain categories kind of get priced up more than other categories. Batting average, like your sharp players are in these 15-team auctions. Like you can only get batting average from certain players, right? Like you sort by standings, gains, points, and batting average, and there's just a very elite select group of guys that are going to really move the needle there. So yeah, it is. You have to make that decision almost ahead of time, right? Like, are you cooking that into your prices, like juicing the batting average category?
Yeah, I don't really manipulate too much based on, like the SGP for a given category. Although, I have talked about that in the past, that if you have a weakness in an area, you could definitely juice it, and that will make players with that statistical profile more appealing to you in auction. So it's something I try to do more intuitively. I have a, it's not a stat, but it's a column in my spreadsheet that's called total. And it's very simple. It's runs plus RBIs plus stolen bases plus homers. Most people don't do that because you're mixing disparate types of stats, but I like it, and I call it pounding the total. I try to get as much total as I possibly can out of my players, and I obviously know from that total which guys are contributing power, which are contributing speed. So I'm usually able to balance it out. But so I tend to find myself just grabbing those high total players, and a lot of times those guys aren't necessarily the high average players. So that's where I can get myself in a little bit of trouble. I usually get there in the other four categories. It's average, then that kind of hurts if I don't prioritize it at the top. And again, those players are so expensive that you're leaving yourself with the possibility of some platoon bats later in your outfield or at your UT. And all 14 players add up to one total stat line. So
right.
As long as you get there, I don't think it really matters how.
So at catcher, I mean, we'll get to, I think, in a second, but I think you did yourself some favors getting Will Smith, Francisco Alvarez for $20 at catcher. That'll help you with the batting average or maybe the batting average, but certainly the power that you left behind with the Kwans and the Arise and the McCarthys. But with your relievers, I went through team by team in this auction and just kind of went through what each team did with their relievers. You got Robert Suarez for 13, Tanner Scott for 9, Ryan Presley for 4. So a combined $26 on 3 relievers. So just, I guess, quickly, like, thoughts on 3 relievers versus 2 relievers in an auction?
Yeah, I think you've picked the 2 most interesting positions that I've seen in these early OLACs, and that's catcher and closers. Just real quick on the catcher one, it's a really interesting market right now. There are about 12 catchers that are going, high single digits, double digits, and then you have like a bunch of $2 and $3 catchers. So I think you have to really make a decision. I see a lot of people punting catcher still. That's never a strategy I've employed. If you want to get that total up, you need to average at least 125 or 130 per catcher. In this case, with Smith and Alvarez, it's more like 150, average between the 2 of them. So I was pretty happy to get 2 for 20. And in the one we'll talk about after the second one, I got 2 for 16 that I really like. So if you can navigate the catcher waters, I think that does give you an edge and helps you to cover any other positional issues you might have. Closers are I'm not clear at all on what to do this season on closers. Obviously we're a few months out still. Right. There's going to be some settling of the market. Hopefully some additional situations become more clearer, which will bring some of the top pricing down and create a little bit more of a distribution. You used to be able to get like an elite closer for like 17 or 18, and then you could get some back end, bottom tier closers like 7 or 8. It's really changed. It's all like double digits. Even guys like Ben Joyce are like $12 or $13. So in this one, obviously there's the concern about Suarez getting traded. The Padres are talking about, basically, trading off their stars on their team. That's the only reason why I think he's $13. He should certainly be higher up with the other closers in that $16, $17 tier. So I figured I'd take a shot. Actually, I was considering maybe punting closers in this first auction because it's so unsettled and I was just so unclear on the strategy. And my file right now is showing closers are overpriced for the first time in that I can remember. Saves are so distributed now over so many different pitchers that the value of one individual save has gone down. But I chickened out and got cold feet. And when Suarez was like the last RP1 on the board, I had a number in mind. It was 13. And if I got him, great. If not, I was going to maybe punt, but I got him for 13. Then I end up getting 2 more. So from going to punting closer to getting 3 closers for $26, that's just the kind of thing that can happen in an auction. Interestingly, after I got Scott, I nominated Presley earlier on. Hodge had only gone for 2. So I'm like, and this was still when he had not waived his no trade clause. So I'm like, all right, people are waiting, or lying in wait for Presley here since Hodge went for so little. So I threw him out, and it was going twice at 3, and I was like, oh, I just did it. I went for, hopefully it works out. Obviously he waived his no trade, and maybe I have 3 closers, maybe I have 2.5, maybe I have 2, maybe I have 1. It's really hard to say. That was kind of the thinking that went into my closer buys in this one.
And then with it being a fab league, are you willing to just cut bait on a Presley or a Scott if they're not getting any saves like in the first couple of months? Or is like a guy like Scott just so good with the strikeouts that you would hold him if it wasn't his job?
Scott, I would probably hold. He's on a great team. If he's looking good this year, but just not getting the regular save allocation, he probably still has a lot of value. There could be some wins in there, some multi-inning stints. So I still would like him. Presley, I'm guessing will get the first shot. He has been declining in his skills, and he's a guy I've gone back to year after year. So for $4, I'm good with it. If he loses his job after a couple of weeks, the 3 weeks, blows a few saves, I would have no trouble getting him. And if it starts out where he's not getting any saves, I would drop him easy. So for the $4, probably worth the gamble there. You kind of broke it down. There were, a lot of teams bought 3 relievers in this one. I think a third of the teams. Mm-hmm. Typically, I don't think you'll see that later on. Right now, I think you could take advantage of the unsettled market and grab a third one, and you have I guess only one team totally punted. So I think you'll see less 3 closer teams. It's really hard in an auction, right? Because you have to come out with 9 pitchers. So 3 closers means only 6 starters. And that's a challenge because typically you'll have a lot of $1, the Stars and Scrubs teams will be just snapping up all these $1 starters late in the auction. Only a few really meaningful starters make it through the reserve round. So if you leave it with a 6-3 split, that makes it tough. You have to really, I ended up, I think, taking 5 starters in the reserve round here out of my 7 picks. Even though I kind of spent more than most on pitching, I still wanted more starters in the reserve. And typically more closer specs are available in the reserve. So I doubt I will leave with a 6-3 split in any of the remaining auctions I do.
Yeah, so in this first one that I alluded to, you alluded to, so 5 teams bought 3 relievers. 1 team spent $53 on 3 relievers. They bought both Diaz's and Emmanuel Clase. 1 team spent $8 on 3 basically closers in waiting: Hodge, Griffin Jacks, Edwin Uceta, and then 9 teams bought 2 relievers. 1 team bought 0 relievers. So a plethora of approaches there, and yeah, it's dicey, man. I've got my first big auction's coming up in about 2 weeks. This is the first year in maybe 4 or 5 years where I'm open to not paying up for 2 closers I really believe in. I don't think I would not get 1, but this might be the first year in a while where I'm okay only getting 1 and then trying to hit on a spec or 2.
Yours is a DC auction, right?
That's the first one. Yep.
Yeah. So I think you have 27 more picks, and you could certainly load up on a bunch of specs. So I think that strategy makes sense. I don't like buying 3 closer specs in an auction. That is something I would never advise. You might end up dropping those 3 immediately because injuries and other players coming up, and you've really hamstrung yourself by only leaving with 6 starters. Now you don't have a sure thing closer. I don't mind taking 3 closer specs in your 7 reserve picks. That's totally fine. I have no problem with that. But I I think it's hard to take even one closer spec in the auction. I would much rather take a SP8 type that has a little upside or has at least a job and maybe has good early season matchups.
You're really putting yourself in a corner with the 3 specs. You have to hit on 2 of them basically, because you're putting yourself behind on the starters. You can't punt closer because you use 3 of your auction spots on it. So, yeah. And so you spent just over 41% on pitching. And then I think in your other one, you spent almost 44% on pitching. It's almost like I kind of assume you're just kind of like you're valuing the pitchers more than the rest of these leagues, or what do you think that is? Is that just kind of a normal spread for you?
No, definitely not a normal spread. I think this is these 2 auctions are, I think, the most I've ever spent on pitching in however long I've been doing auctions, which is a long time. No, I think we've talked about this. When you're setting your valuations, you want to set them to what the market is. So I'll look at the previous 5, typically 5, maybe 10, depending on how, what the volume is. I will look at the pitcher hitter split, and that's what I plug in to Tanner's spreadsheet. And that's what gives me valuations. You want to be agnostic as to the values. You don't want to go in knowing that pitchers are going to look better to you than hitters. Now, that being said, every auction is different, which is said every single time, but it's true. And you have to kind of play the room. So if the pitching, if the hitting is going for more than they had gone previously, and the second auction, we'll talk about that more, but that's, it just went haywire in my opinion. Then all of a sudden, yes, the pitchers look to be better, have better profit potential in auction. I tend to overspend the market $5 to $10 just generally in pitching. And I think that just kind of plays to my strengths. I think I like the ability to find those $2 and $3 hitters later that might be undervalued. They give you a good total, but maybe not average. So no one really wants them, but they have good playing time and they could really fill some holes. I find it harder to get pitchers in that category. So I tend to overspend the market on pitching typically. These 2 were a little bit extreme, and it's something I'm going to have to kind of work through to figure out how it's going to look as I move forward. So you don't want to be so out of whack with the market. And I think, I might have gone a little bit too extreme. There were several, I think in both auctions, there were, I think at least 7 or 8 teams in each that did spend 105 or over in pitching. So I'm not out there on an island. I'd say half the league is spending up, but the problem is you have like 3 or 4 players who are spending like $60 on pitching, and that's where that extra money all goes to hitting, and that's where it kind of creates that imbalance.
Yeah, and I'm the opposite. I am always going to sort of spend a little bit extra on hitting relative to the market. So it's just it's auctions are so fun because you can just play to your strengths and you can map out a plan. And now you got Tariq Skubal in both auctions, and obviously a fantastic pitcher. We don't get into like the skills necessarily, but $36 Skubal. I'll actually mention this now, but one of the things I was going to bring up in the AAV versus ADP, Paul Skeens is firmly ahead of Tariq Skubal in ADP, although Tariq Skubal actually has a higher AAV. So is Skubal like shaping up to just be a guy you're trying to get in a ton of drafts this year, or do you just think it was a mistake by the market in both cases to let you get him at 36?
I don't think it's a mistake. I think that's a appropriate price. He's, when you pass on first round hitters, and Lindor, I think in this, in the first one is borderline, call him a back end or early second. So if I'm passing on a first round hitter, I like to get a first round pitcher if I can. You don't want to leave many drafts or auctions without a first round talent. I think, you would never voluntarily give up your first rounder in a snake draft, right? So I think the same thing applies. You can certainly play more spread the wealth and go for a bunch of second and third rounders. And I'm totally fine with that. And I do that also. But if I think the pitcher in the first round, and I think later we'll kind of just look at the first round AAV compared to, their current ADP, he's about the same overpay as that next tier, like the Gilberts, the Wheelers, down to the Sales. So if they're all like $4 or $5 over where I have them valued, give me the top guy or guys. I certainly was not planning on getting Skubal in both. In the first one, I was trying to get Skeens. Someone went 37. I just didn't want to go 38. Now you're pushing it up, I think, to a point where I'm a little uncomfortable. In this one, Skeens came out second, and I just was not prepared. I should have been ready to hit the 36 button. I missed my chance. Someone else did. Actually, the team who bought him in the first auction had him for 36, and I probably should hit 37, but I'll be honest, I think I guarantee they go 38. That's just knowing like your opposition. They had gone Ohtani, Skeens in the first one. Ohtani gets noms first in the second one. They lose out on him at $54. So they were in at 53. Someone went 54. So I know they were probably dying, and I don't think they were going to let Skeens go. So if I go 37, which I probably should, just knowing that information, I should have done it, push them to 38, or worst case scenario, I get them for $1 over my number. So after that, I was like, all right, if I can get Skubal for 36 again, I'll give it a shot. If I'm only doing 8 leagues this year, do I want him in more than 2? Probably not. Obviously, we know the high-end pitching has that injury potential, and you don't want to tank all of your teams. Although I don't think you're losing, like you're guaranteed to lose your league if you lose your top pitcher. I think you could certainly still compete. We talked about last year I had Acuna last year for 56. I still ended up cashing that league. So I don't think it's a death knell. So I'm not afraid of doing it, but I do like the other pitchers in that top tier, and I'll probably diversify a little more going forward.
Yeah, it's tough. I mean, I don't know exactly like how in on Skubal you were before those 2 auctions, but then it's like if you were in on him, yeah, now you're worried. Now you're thinking in the back of your head about exposure. But you also are in on Sonny Gray and Luis Castillo, who you got in both auctions as SP2 and SP3. And that's not surprising to me because, like you said, you were going up, you're kind of spreadsheet drafting with the pitchers. Like, I couldn't think of 2 more like obvious guys that the spreadsheet's going to like more than the auction room than Sonny Gray and Luis Castillo. So, I mean, Sonny Gray especially, it's just the projections love him. He was amazing last year. He's just a slam dunk value. There's just that tiny thing. It's just like he's old, and he surprised us with how good he was the year before. But I mean, at the price you're getting Sonny Gray, he can certainly regress a little bit. So what did you think about the Castillo Gray pair ups after Skubal?
Yeah, I know this for sure. I've never gotten the same top 3 starters in any auctions, and especially not back to back. So that was completely unplanned and probably not the smartest decision I've made. In the first one, yeah, go ahead. What'd you say? I
said we'll see.
We'll see. No, in the first one, yeah, they jumped off the spreadsheet. Clearly, they are just. I do another exercise. I look like the top 30 pitchers by projected WHIP, ERA, and strikeout, and I just look to see how many are in the top 30 of all 3 of those categories. There's only 9 of them this year, and I got 3 of them. So if there's only 9 and I'm getting 3, I'm going to like at least my projected ratio and strikeout foundation there. That's something I like to look at because I know if I do that, I'm gonna have a good start on my pitching. I just need to kind of keep it going throughout the auction. Those 2. I guess I'm kind of ambivalent on. I think for the price, and I got them for 16 in the first and then 14 in the second. So I wouldn't have paid the same 16 in the second. 14 though, I'm like I just can't. I can't pass this up. These are only 150 OLACs too. Obviously, I take every league seriously. If I'm only doing 8, these are 2 of my 8 leagues. So I certainly want to do well, and there's always the overall component. But it's not going to kill me if I botch those 2 and they end up not doing well. The odds of them not doing well are pretty low. I think they're pretty stable, pretty good track records, good parks. Maybe the teams aren't as great, so the wins could be a little questionable. But I think I'll get a good floor out of them. There's clearly no ceiling there. I hopefully mixed in some ceiling later in the auctions, and obviously Skubal is a high ceiling player as well. So I think it's an interesting combination. Basically skipping the SP. I mean, I have those guys as SP2s, obviously, but skipping a whole tier basically to go down to them. I could see different mixes where they're not as needed. If I'm going 3 guys that are 18 to 25, that'll probably get me the same overall cost of the 3 that I did here without having to land on them.
So this second auction, you said it just kind of went haywire on the valuations. Do you want to kind of like walk through that before we kind of talk about your specific buys?
Yeah. So, going into these auctions, the split was like 165 hitting, 95 pitching, which was actually up at maybe $1 pitching than last year. Last year was maybe, pretty close. So, for the second one, I went in with that same split in mind. This one ended up 178-82. So it was 165-95. So 13 more on hitting, 13 less on pitching. So that means hitting obviously got way priced up. Some very aggressive players really prioritizing hitting. So, it's the old zig when they zag maneuver. And I ended up going 146-114, which again, I think is the most I've ever spent on pitching in an auction. So I went the other direction. I built what I think is a pretty ridiculous 15-team staff. And I still got there in hitting, at least by projections. I think I have a really good balanced team, a little light and average. We could talk about that. But for the 146, I think I wrung out the most possible potential production as I could have for that price. And then that excess money on pitching gives me, I think, a big leg up in this particular league. I don't know if this is a great overall team because of that kind of extreme build, but I think, for the league, I certainly like where this team is positioned, at least on paper right now. Yeah,
you've got a really you just did a really efficient job, I think, of spreading the money on offense with Gabriel Moreno and Logan O'Hoppe as your 2 catchers for was that $16?
Yep.
And I love the approach that you had in both of these to get 2 real catchers. Moreno, the weakest of the 3, of the 4 probably, but just getting those real catchers that are going to actually be in the lineup a bunch and putting up a bunch of counting stats. And then you got Josh Naylor, Bryson Stott, O'Neill Cruz, Willie Castro, Encarnacion Strand, Gleyber Torres, Kyle Schwarber, James Wood, Taylor Ward, Jake McCarthy, Adolis Garcia, George Springer. So those are all pretty much everyday guys except Stott. We'll probably sit against lefties. Willie Castro, sort of a kind of an everyday guy, but doesn't have like a set position. Encarnacion Strand, who knows? But yeah, I mean, really, really nice job given how much you spent on that crazy pitching staff.
Right. So 146 hitting, that's the kind of team you get, right? And yeah, Stott I like. I think I don't mind getting a piece of that Phillies offense. The one thing, Castro could be like a, kind of a fill-in. So, if it's a 2 lefty weekend and Castro's in there on a Friday, so hopefully build in a little redundancy where I could cover for some of those guys. Yeah, I took a shot on CES. That was definitely a impulse buy. Waxman went 2 and I went 3. So I figured. And then he told me later, nah, I didn't really want him. I wanted someone else, but I don't know if that's true. But anyway, I was,
Well, I don't know if that was true, but I definitely know that he would have said that.
The more I read up on him, though, I'm actually a little bit excited that I have him on his team. On this team, I think for a cheaper hitting team, he gives me a little bit of potential there, upside. If he plays, he could be a really good buy there. Yeah, it's a pretty boring team. Not gonna lie, there's not. I don't even have a $30 bat, which is a little bit uncomfortable. Coming out with O'Neal Cruz as your top hitter isn't necessarily.
This is why you struggle with average.
This team is projected to be like a 252 average. The benchmark's like 254, so it's not like horrible, but certainly when your top couple players don't have a higher than 260 average projection, you're probably not going to get there unless you backfill with an Arise. So yeah, this is one where I feel really good about the power, the speed, and the counting stats. Obviously, average is a little of a challenge here. I was really happy with those catchers because the catcher market was really aggressive here and pushed up. And that's kind of the excitement of an auction. That's when you get like that pit in your stomach, like, oh my God, how am I going to do this? And then when you execute, it just feels so good. So to get those 2 for 16, and I think getting Moreno kind of saved my average from being like a lost cause. So I was pretty happy with that. I think, Schwarber is an interesting component to any build. You're obviously, when you buy him, if you don't have a really good plan, and I don't think I did yet, I've been talking about, how do you make Schwarber a pick in an overall contest? You have to have some other positions or players that can kind of cover for that. He's gone the cheapest of the 3 UTs, not counting Ohtani, the Rooker and Ozuna. Rooker and Ozuna went for 25 in the first one. It was some crazy back and forth, and Schwarber's gone for 16 in both. So he's someone I think people are going to have to consider in auctions. I went back to the well with Adolis. I love what I saw in Jeff's Mining the News today. A nice, good puff piece on how good he feels, and he changed his swing and da-da-da-da-da. And he's always been a guy that I've gravitated towards, and I feel like there's maybe a little upside there. Springer, can he get worse? Probably. Can he get better? Hopefully. So, yeah, I think given where the spending was, and I just try to rely on my knowledge of these hitters and what I think they might do this year. And a lot of these guys are big profit potential for the prices I got them at. So this is definitely not a hitting squad that most people are going to be like, ooh, that looks really good. Most people are probably going to cringe to see that. That's okay. I don't mind building a really boring spread the wealth offense if that's what the auction calls for.
Yeah, you're not trying to.
It's not a beauty pageant. It's not a beauty pageant. That's for
sure. Now you said you have 0 $1 players in either auction. So obviously, I would guess that was by design. You touched on that. Kind of an auction strategy piece there, but for people that maybe haven't thought about it, like what's the thinking behind making sure you have money to make sure you're not stuck with $1 guys?
No, it's really not by design. Hopefully this is just giving the real view of what auctions are about and how you have to be very agile and you have to understand the dynamics of that particular auction room, what the economy looks like, and try to make the most plus EV decisions you can and not be stuck on a particular either strategy or plan or like ethos. So I've said you do want a few $1 players if that's what the room is doing. So in the first one, there were 45 $1 players. There were 60 in the second one, which is a big number. So that means teams average 3 or 4, and I have 0. I think you want to maybe have 1 or 2 because, like in this second one, a team that went crazy hitting ended up getting a bunch of $6 and $7 pitchers for $1. If you only get $2 and $3 and up players, you're giving up your chance to get any $1 players and getting the potential value that they bring. So I think I did a really good job of managing my money. We've talked about that. You always want to have purchasing power throughout the auction. I don't usually have the hammer at the end, and I'm not saying I had the hammer here. There were a bunch of $2 and $3 guys that I ended up liking, and I was able to get. I think on the hitting side, the way it looks this year is the $1 hitters are not everyday players. So if you're getting $1 hitters, you're getting platoon guys. You're not getting playing time. So if you come out with no $1 hitters, I think that's maybe good. However, there are there are numerous $1 pitchers that have jobs, that will pitch innings, that will accrue stats. And I think you can get some potential value there. So I'm not sure if I'm spending $114 on pitching, I don't need any $1 pitchers. But if I knock it down to $105, I'll probably have one hitter. So I don't think you want more than two $1 players, but I'm not sure you definitely want zero. I think on the hitting side, just to recap, you'll get more playing time if you can have a couple $2 or $3 guys at the end for your CI, your MI, and your UT.
Well, Mark, is there anything you want to hit on about these two auctions before we get into some of that AAV versus ADP talk?
Yeah, just a couple things you had on the outline. One is I came out of each with a stack. Now, stack is typically more of a football term.
Mm-hmm. People
in football are stack crazy. That's all they want to do. I don't usually go that route, so it's weird that I have 2-3 player stacks here. I kind of came in green to these two. I was looking more at potential profit and which guys seem to jump out. And I honestly didn't give the team context as much of a look. So I end up with Happ, PCA, and Bush on my first auction, a Cubs stack, and then Naylor, Moreno, and McCarthy on the second one. I'm just curious your thoughts. I typically, the problem with the stack is, right, if that team is not a good hitting team, that's more than, that's almost a quarter of your hitting that is exposed there. And there could be a week where they're playing the Dodgers and the Braves, and, you basically could have a lost week, when they're playing, 6 great starters. So I like to diversify, 2 is fine. So 3, I'm surprised I have 3. I think the Cubs are low-key maybe a good offense this year. If I like 3 of their players, I must like their offense. And, we know Arizona had the most runs scored. They'll probably regress, but I think they'll still be solid. So just your thoughts. Is it something that you look at, these particular teams in particular? Obviously there's some great hitting teams that you'd love to have a stack on, but that's going to cost you a lot more. These are pretty cheap stacks, I think, relative to the other teams that you might want to look at.
Yeah, I think it's sort of almost borderline as to whether, to me, a stack is you're getting 3 of the top 4 or 5 hitters in a good lineup. And so I guess with these 2 stacks, you might be getting 3 of the top 4 or 5 hitters in those lineups, but I don't know if we know exactly where those 3 guys are going to bat all season.
Right. Gotcha.
So it's kind of borderline as to whether I would even call them a true stack, if you'd bought Mookie Betts and Freddie Freeman and Teoscar Hernandez or something, that's a bringing you the goods type of stack.
That's a DFS thing, right? In DFS, people will stack a team for DFS and top 3 or 4 hitters, right? That's a typical strategy.
Yeah, and so I think with these 2 stacks, I don't have any. I don't see any. I don't actually see really any downside to these 3, tying hitching your wagon to these 2 offenses. But I definitely don't think Arizona is gonna be a bad offense to have some pieces of. And PCA, I was actually just chatting with someone about PCA today, and yeah, he's fascinating because if he ends up holding a leadoff job all year, then he's a mega value. But I don't know for sure if he's going to hold it all year, that type of thing.
It sounds like Happ's going to start at the leadoff, and I do have Happ on that team. PCA I think just brings an interesting skill set. These 15-30 guys, 10-30 guys do have some value in this current climate as long as you can get some of that additional power elsewhere. and they seem to be underpriced because they don't bring the power stats. So I think there's like a lot of players that fall in that bucket this year. So I think you're going to probably have to, grab, a guy from that type of tier. So yeah, I think that's all right. McCarthy is an interesting one. People seem to think he's not going to be a full-time player. And, I don't know if the Grichuk signing changes anything or if that was already kind of baked in. He just, he's a total spreadsheet buy now. He's a screaming buy right now. I'm not going to have 8 shares. I'll tell you that. Right now, while it's cheap, I did it. If it's announced that he's going to have an everyday role, his price will double, if not triple, with that stolen base upside and a pretty decent average. Or if it looks like he's just a short platoon. I mean, I guess he's a lefties, but they have a lot of other lefties. I'm not really an Alec Thomas believer, so I'm a little bullish on him, but he'll be interesting. I'll probably have to moderate my, my exposure there and not go too crazy. I'd say the last thing you kind of asked, just like my general thoughts. I've kind of mentioned them, but I think people are more aggressive than ever on the top hitters, and that's something I'm gonna, hopefully will show itself in the valuations as we go forward, and that will help me modulate a little bit towards getting some hitting, but. It's that decision you're going to have to make. Are you going to jump in and overpay in quotes for these hitters, or play the room and look for possible profit elsewhere? I think the closer market is unsettled as ever and is currently a little overpriced. So is that going to, that might moderate, if starting pitching gets pushed up as it always does late in draft season. I think some of the closer prices will come down. And then I just think the last thing I would say is just the reserve rounds seem more important than ever. I think if you can play the reserve rounds right, there's a real big edge to be had there. Of course, we know we're going to turn over a third of our roster at least, and probably out of your 7 reserve guys, you might keep 1 all season, if that. And if you keep 1, that you probably did a good job. But I just think the reserve rounds are really important. That's where you can maybe get an edge. A lot of auction players are pretty much toast by the end of the auction, and I'm not sure they're giving the reserve round as much. I feel really good given my lack of reps so far that I came out of the reserve rounds, I think, with some potential hits and some guys that I think fit those teams well. So that's one thing I think I did well so far is the reserve rounds.
Nice. Well, we got to head to a quick message from our sponsors. And when we come back, Mark and I are going to get into some interesting disagreements between AAV and ADP and which players the auction drafters are more interested in or more aggressive on. So stay tuned. So Fantrax is the site that you want to be playing all of your leagues on, especially your dynasty leagues, anything to do with keeper, dynasty, daily lineups. I just did a massive dynasty startup where we did the auction on the Fantrax forum message board, and then we did the snake draft after that. And it's the only place I want to do any kind of drafting, especially when there's prospects involved. You don't want to have to be messaging your commissioner, telling them you want certain prospects in there. Fantrax has all the prospects you need. It's customizable. You can change the categories. If you don't like wins, you can move to different variations of quality starts. If you don't like saves, you can move to different variations of save plus holds. So go to Fantrax, sign up for free today, be entered to win an official MLB signed jersey from Vladimir Guerrero Jr. Simply go to fantrax.com/rotowire and sign up today. That's fantrax.com/rotowire. Fantrax, the home of fantasy sports. Edge Boost. Have you ever had a debit card declined or had to call your bank at 3 a.m. in Vegas? Edge Boost is the first consumer-facing online bank dedicated to the gaming industry. There are numerous benefits using Edge Boost: $250K per day in debit deposits, unlimited withdrawals, cash back on sports betting, DFS, sweeps, 100% approval for all gaming activity, financial segmentation for discretion and responsible gaming, compatible today for prediction markets, iCasino, DFS, sports betting, lottery, brick and mortar casinos, horse racing, and sweeps. No transaction reviews or account freezes. Visit edgeboost.bet today and use promo code ROTOPOD. That's promo code ROTOPOD. All right, Mark, we're back. So, when I look at the first AAV data that NFBC posts after the first handful of drafts, I'm always interested to kind of see what the differences are between the AAV and the ADP. There's a lot of groupthink that goes into the ADP, but a lot of the ADP was also set before the projection systems get released. A lot of the ADP is set before a bunch of people start talking about their sleepers and stuff like that. So, what do you think is kind of the difference between AAV and ADP? Like, which types of players do you expect to see going for a bit more relatively? Like, is it just a sharper market, or are people gravitating to a certain type of player?
Yeah, I'm not sure it's a sharper market. I think snake drafters are just as sharp. And as you said, ADP is so sticky and it's set so early. And even though, as you said, the sleepers haven't come out, the projections haven't come out, it's still an anchoring effect. It just holds those players in place. And people are afraid to step out of line and to pick a guy 10 picks ahead or, 20 picks ahead, even if that's where they have them valued. You play either ADP chicken or you don't want to look stupid. Oh, you could have had him later and you got him. So I think people are a little timid in really making major moves on already established ADP. So that's why the ADP just moves glacially, unless you have a big event, right? Someone gets hurt or a big closer change, etc. So it's just really sticky. It's hard to move. And AAV, there are fewer auctions, right? So there's more movement, extreme buys. Like you have those people who have $15 left for one player and spend $15 on a $1 player. All of a sudden, that player's AAV goes up $2 for no reason. So there's less auctions. So I think there's more movement there. There's also the dynamic of if you have two people in an auction room who want a player, they are not shy about going tit for tat, and all of a sudden the guy's going for 5 or 10. Like I said, Rooker and Ozuna went for 25. Their AAV was 16 going into that first auction. Now their AAV is 20 after the last two, right? It could change just like that. So people aren't afraid to go $5 or $10 over, not just their valuation, but AAV. If that's the guy they want, people go into auctions, they want to get their guys. So I think there's a little bit more of that going on as far as a different dynamic, and you're willing to pay whatever it takes. So if it just takes two to tango, and all of a sudden you're changing AAV and AAV is out the window, so to speak, as opposed to how ADP, stays a lot closer. I think the type of players are those really sexy players, right? The Wyatt Langfords, the players that people really want to get a share on. Whatever's in the zeitgeist of the moment, whoever all the pods and analysts are talking about, that's who people want. And that's who tends to go, I think, higher in AAV than in ADP. And on the flip side, it's the really old, boring veteran players who I think typically will go higher in ADP than AAV. So I think it's kind of like that player type that tends to attract people to pay more for them in auctions or ignore really in auctions, like a $6 George Springer. He's definitely better than a $6 player, but no, who wants George Springer this year? Nobody. So, but in ADP, he'll still go within a round at worst of where he's been going all this time. So that's where, if you're a player like me who doesn't mind missing out on the sexy players and is good with the old boring vets, that's why I go to auctions. I seem to have a little bit of an edge doing it that way.
So you put together this first round essentially of the dollar distribution for players that are going in the first round over the past few weeks in DCs, and the biggest guy who's going for more in auctions than he is, or getting treated better in auctions than he is in snake drafts in that first round, is Corbin Carroll, who has an AAV of 41, which is ahead of Jose Ramirez, Gunnar Henderson, Kyle Tucker, Juan Soto, etc. Aaron Judge is at 45, Bobby Witt at 49, Shohei Ohtani at 50. So what do you think about Corbin Carroll? Like I'm a big fan. I would have no problem leaving an auction with him as my most expensive player, but I would say that about a bunch of these guys. So not a bunch of these guys. I'd say that about a handful of these guys. So where are you at on the Corbin Carroll hype? I don't know if I'd be paying this price, but what do you think?
Yeah, just first, I like to do this exercise because, as I said earlier, I like to come out of an auction with a first round player. For a couple of years, it was Ohtani. He was going the back of the first round, but I guess because he was UT only, he was in the low 30s. So I just like, the spread here is from Vlad at 35 to Ohtani at 50. That's a $15 spread for 15 spots, ADP spots. That's a pretty big spread. So I'll always look at who's on the lower end because I typically, other than Acuna last year, I typically won't go for like the top 2 or 3 hitters or players in the first round. So I just, just as an exercise, I like to look at this and target one of the players going for cheaper, but who's still a first round talent. So far, it's been Skubal for me, but there are a couple other hitters here who I think you conceivably would be happy with as a first rounder. Yeah, Carroll's one of those guys who people have it's recency bias. They have very short memories. They forgot about that. I remember we were talking, he's going to be like a 5th round player this year, after that horrible first half, a massive second half. I think he's great. I have no problem with where he's going, as the 9th overall player. 41 feels a little rich for me. I think, Mookie at 36, Tatis at 37. I might be more apt to do that myself, but I don't have a problem with it. Interestingly, though, more than Gunnar, Tucker, and Soto, that I have a little bit. I don't think I would take. I don't think I would take any of those 3 over him at the same price or at a cheaper price. But I think that's a really interesting early dynamic. We'll see if that lasts throughout the auction season.
Yeah, honestly, I was hoping that drafters would have a bit longer memories. I thought that he would just kind of be, 11th, 12th, something like that by AAV. But yeah, I get it for sure. So I mentioned a few more outfielders here. I want to go position by position. Carroll definitely stands out as the first round guy. Jazz Chisholm is going a little bit higher in AAV versus ADP. Wyatt Langford. I mean, those are two kind of. I think Jazz Chisholm still has like some shine, right? Like obviously, like with the Yankees and getting the dual eligibility. Do you take anything out of those ones, Jazz and Wyatt? Also got Brent Doyle, James Wood, Josh Lowe. Josh Lowe, I think, is interesting. We'll talk about him in a second. But like any of those guys after Carroll stand out as interesting that they're going for more in AAV than ADP or vice versa?
Yeah, Wood jumps out a little bit. 20th by AAV. And 7, gotta make sure I'm reading this right. And 17th by ADP. So he's attractive to me, in the low 20s, player with, a good degree of pedigree. And I think showed fairly well, physical specimen, tall dude, but gives me some Strawberry vibes a little bit back to my Mets days. So he's someone obviously I got already. So I'm interested. This is where it hurts. Like Jazz was a guy I loved last year. I thought he was undervalued. He was a big cog in a few of my teams. I really loved Churio this year, and to see them going for so much so early, and there really wasn't a buying opportunity. I'm not saying I won't leave with one of them. I certainly, the one thing about AAV is this mentality that if let's say their AAVs are 36, whatever. If in an auction I can swoop it at 34, even if I have that to be a pretty good overpay, I'll do it. If I could find any reason to get a guy like for example Soto in the second one, I was like, yeah, you know what, for my key Mets I have to try to get at least a share here and there. So I went into that second one. I was going to go for a big bat, and his AAV was 36. I'm like, maybe I could, I can go with that. Maybe even 37. He goes for 40, of course. So the one time when I psyched myself up, all of a sudden there was a bidding war. So, I think Doyle's a little surprising to me that he's going more in auctions than ADP. That one kind of surprised me a little bit. Langford does it, but Doyle, I would have thought maybe just because people hate the Rockies, that he would. Like I made a living. Well, I made a fantasy living for several years on Arenado. Back in the day, he was just always underpriced. Blackman, but Doyle seems to have kind of risen above that morass that's the Rockies, and I'm a little surprised by that one.
I am too. And it's, it doesn't look like any of the projections that have come out in the last week are like any rosier than Steamer that was out first. I mean, I guess a tick here in batting average, but yeah, the Doyle one being more popular in auctions surprised me. Yeah, I think like Langford's just a classic case, but the Josh Lowe one, I wish I'd left a few of my earlier DCs with some Josh Lowe. I think I maybe got him in one. But just the more people talk about that, the park they're going to play in, Steinbrenner Field, and just the more the Rays kind of go through this offseason seemingly without acquiring a bunch of partners for these left-handed bats, I definitely see the appeal for Josh Lowe, and he's up to OF 33 by AAV and OF 37 by ADP.
And I think that is a result of a big event, right? The stadium having that hurricane damage, switching to a new field. That happened in the midst of drafting season. So he was already pretty anchored, as you said, from the pre-hurricane valuation. And since the auctions have come after that, yes, you're seeing him up. And I wouldn't be surprised if he goes up even higher. Everyone seems to be mentioning him and mentioning this lefty situation. I kind of like that because I think it's maybe a little bit overblown. I'm feeling like I might be able to get some good buys elsewhere if I don't follow that trend, but it certainly could be very material, and those guys could go off this year, possibly.
Sure, yeah. I talked about that a little bit with Phil. What was that last week? Catcher. We've got a interesting one where Cal Raleigh had about a 20 spot higher ADP in these recent draft champions than Will Smith, but Will Smith has a higher AAV than Cal Raleigh. So is that all just people being lower on Smith when they thought? I'm kind of confused by this one, honestly. I know Dalton Rushing isn't much of a thing anymore, but I don't think people thought he was going to cut a ton into Will Smith's catching playing time.
Yeah, this is interesting. I got Smith for 12 in the first one, and that's the first time I've rostered him in a long time. His price was always 16, 18, and I just felt that was a little bit too much for his profile. In that same one, though, Raleigh went for 11, which speaks to kind of what you're talking about here. Once I saw that, I was like, I would have rathered him for 11 than Smith for 12. So it's still only 8 auctions in. My bet is you're going to see that flip, and you're going to see Raleigh probably edge him out by a couple dollars in AAV, give it another 8 auctions or so.
Okay.
Smith does have the lineup advantage, and I think maybe it's just a little reaction to him being a little bit overlooked this year, and there's some value hunters like myself propping him up a little bit in the auctions. But I think that'll flip. I think Raleigh will end up going for more in auctions than Smith at the end of the day.
And then what about Logan O'Hoppe versus JT Realmuto? O'Hoppe a bit more popular by ADP, but Realmuto going ahead of O'Hoppe. Do you think that was the Darno goes to the Angels, and then there's a bit of a backtrack in the valuations there, but the ADP is sticky? Yeah,
I think that's for sure part of it. I think Realmuto is just a brand name, and even though people who've been drafting for a while, they're like, he's really declining. I'm not sure the speed's going to come back to where it's at. Still in a good lineup, but he really, I think last year was a little bit of a downer. It's still a brand name, though. So it's just one of those things where it's just almost he gets thrown out and people like sit up in their chairs a little bit and they're willing to buy him at his now more reasonable cost. And, Hoppy is one of those guys that hasn't really shown it yet. So those are typically not going to go for double digits. But Realmuto is enough of a household name that I think he will. So I think that this one might continue. I think Realmuto might come in at a higher AAV at the end of the day than O'Hoppy.
What do you think about the market pushing up Cody Bellinger by AAV since we've found out he's going to be a Yankee?
Yeah, part of the anchoring we've talked about. It's the Yankee effect. Yankees just get pushed up, and I think it might even be more pronounced in auctions. It just seems like any Yankee is going to go for a little bit more. There's that Yankee or that New York tax that seems to be in place. So I think there's a little bit of exuberance for him in that lineup and in that ballpark, and I think that one might continue. I think he'll probably end up as a higher first baseman position than he will be in ADP. I think this one will hold.
What do you think about Jose Altuve versus Ozzie Albies? There's, Altuve is going ahead of Albies in both ADP and AV, and I'm using recent ADP. Obviously, I think there'd be even bigger discrepancies if I was just using full offseason ADP, but recent ADP, Altuve is going ahead, but they're about the same. And then AAV, Altuve is at 22 and Albies is at 18.
They might both converge around 20. Altuve's still considered a really good player, definitely name value. Albies, there might be a little overcorrection here to the Braves last year. I think a lot of people got burned by going Braves heavy last year. I was one of them in a few leagues. And I think he's still maybe paying a little bit of a penalty for that. He went for, I think, 17 in the second one, and I kind of kicked myself. Weirdly, I wanted Ketel Marte, so I threw Albies out first to try to siphon off someone who wanted a second base high-priced player, and it backfired. Albies went for 17, and Marte went for, I think, 25 or 26. So I ended up with neither of them, and that's where I ended up with Bryson Stott. So that one, I think I maybe made a mistake. I probably should have just, even though I was counting on Marte going, because his AAV was usually, a little bit, his min max was pretty close, so I wasn't expecting that big jump up. I probably should have just grabbed Albies. I think they might get a little closer, but I think Altuve will probably end up having a slightly higher AAV than Albies. Albies might be a good buy this year because of that.
Okay, this one is, so I'm a Jordan Westburg guy. You've got Matt McClain on one of your teams. So I think you're a Matt McClain over Jordan Westburg guy, but Westburg going ahead in ADP, McClain just a dollar, just slightly ahead in AAV, but McClain over Westburg for you?
It's yes. Current spreadsheet, yes. McClain comes out quite a bit higher in valuation than Westburg. He's looking like a kind of a neutral buy where I have Westburg as an overpay right now. So from a projection standpoint, I think it points to McClain being a better buy. I think in the second one, Westburg went for 20. So that was his AAV, I think, was like 15 coming in. So that was a big push up. You almost never see something that extreme. McClain, I think I bought at kind of slightly over where I have him. So yeah, obviously when you speak, you are the button of fantasy baseball.
Okay, so
people definitely listen.
Yeah, but while you were saying that, I just was sort of having almost flashbacks to how much I was in on Gleyber Torres last year and remembering like the price just kept kind of going up the closer we kept getting to opening day. And I feel like that's happening with Westberg a little bit. So, and they're going for like the exact same price. So I was really in on Glaber last year. So take my Westberg love for what it's worth. And
well, I'm swooping in on the. You know what? I'm taking the Glaber rebound. I mean, I'm swooping in at I think $3 and $5. I'll take that all day right now as a nice little blue guy. And maybe pretty light projection, 17 homers. Maybe it's not a great park. Maybe he can squeak out 20. But anyway, but when you say you like a guy, I definitely, my ears perk up for sure.
Well, yeah, I mean, I love the corner middle eligibility with Westberg. I think he's kind of like 25-10 is sort of like just a very reasonable, like kind of what I would just expect him to do. And I think there's room for a bit more, especially with them moving the fences in left field. Bryce Terang, AAV, not as high on Bryce Terang as ADP, and then Luis Rengifo kind of flipped. AAV likes Rengifo more than ADP. I like Rengifo quite a bit more than Terang, just because I think if you look at the power he put out in 2022 and 2023, it just kind of fell off last year, and then he's hurt. But if you take the power that he had in 2022 and 2023 and combine it with the speed that he had in 2024 playing for Ron Washington, like you can squint and see 20, 40 upside with Rengifo. Like that's like a crazy line to throw out there for him. But like I can squint and see that with Rengifo. And Terang, it's just we know he's not getting to 20 homers. The 50 steals was there, but what do you think about those two? Terang being higher by ADP compared to AV and Rengifo being the opposite.
Yeah, Terang was a great $1 buy last year. He really tied the room together for several of my teams. It's always scary when the next year he's going for like $7 and you're like, and he kind of really faded there late. Yeah, Rengifo seems like a really good player. That multi-position eligibility. I just want to mention, quick pivot, but you mentioned that Willie Castro buy. I had to point this out. With all that positionality in auction, when you have to come out with 23 players, exactly, by the positions, I just had so much fun with him in that auction. I moved him around to like 3 or 4 different positions, which gave me maximum flexibility to get the buy I wanted, and it wasn't dictated by position. So I just want to throw that out there as just a little advantage in auction of some of these multi-position guys. As long as you're being smart and moving them around, and in the online auctions, you have to do it yourself. If you're clogged at corner, you can't nominate or bid on a corner. So you have to move them to middle or to UT or whatever. So just a quick editorial on that. Yeah, I like Rengifo better. I think he'll end up having a higher AAV. It's interesting that it's flipped in the DCs, especially with the multi-position for Rengifo. Typically, those guys get a little bump in there. So that one's a little surprising to me.
Yeah, Willie Castro is this year's Luis Rengifo. Last year, Luis Rengifo had the eligibility crown. This year, Willie Castro does. This is a kind of a classic one. So at shortstop, Corey Seager, O'Neal Cruz, CJ Abrams are really bunched up by ADP. But in auctions, it's Cruz at 26, Abrams 24, Seager at 21. You got Cruz, obviously, Abrams, we know the stolen base upside there. Seager, it just every year he's missing time. Like, what do you think? Like, are you taking the speedsters or the old guy that's missing time with the high batting average?
I think Seager is, by my valuations in AAV, he's a little bit of a he's a less of an overpay where he's going than the other two. So I think, pure value based auctioning, I like Seager better. Now, we want fantasy to be fun again, right? So that's why I keep going back to O'Neill. I just love this guy, and I just want to have him the year he really goes off, if he does. Abrams is another kind of player that in that same mold. So this goes back to what we were saying earlier. People want the hype pick, and they don't want the boring old guy, especially a guy who's gotten injured and doesn't bring much steals to a position where you typically need some bags. So this one makes sense. I don't think this will change. I think, if anything, you might see Cruz and Abrams go up a little bit, and I don't think Seager will move much from where he's at right now.
What do you think of there being a big gap in Xavier Edwards where he's valued? He's shortstop 17 in recent ADP and shortstop 13 in the early AAV.
Speed is everywhere, but it's still hard to get enough of it. So as you were, this goes back to our discussion about Arise earlier. He's a guy that if your early build is speed deficient, you're going to overpay a couple dollars to try to reel him in, especially with his average upside as well. So, those guys who are really potentially elite or can really contribute in one, if not two categories, I think are going to pop a little more in auctions, because you can kind of build that into your roster construction and how you want to go, where typically in snakes, you're just kind of going along and, you're trying to build a balanced team, but sometimes, and it's hard to bail yourself out in those snakes. Whereas in an auction, if he hasn't been nominated yet, you could be sitting there going, I'm going to pump him up a couple extra dollars to make sure I get him. Sometimes in these auctions, you get desperate. Like, if I don't get this 20 or 30 steal guy or this 280 hitter, I'm going to be not happy with my build, and you just pay up. So this one doesn't totally surprise me, and I think this one will stick.
Yeah, I mentioned Edwards to your partner Mike Mager on the pod a few months ago, and he's just such an interesting auction piece to me because of what you said, like the two categories, batting average, steals. If you get Edwards and you get him early enough in your auction, like, he's such an interesting piece to build around, whereas you can't do that in a snake draft. You don't want to be like, all right, like, now I'm taking Xavier Edwards like 2.5 rounds ahead of ADP here. So yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Isaac Paredes is going higher. I think that's just strictly due to the trade, which I love. Isaac Paredes, the Astro. I had no interest in Isaac Paredes, the Cub, so I understand his jump. We talked about Skubal versus Skeens. Cole Ragans is a pitcher that the auction market is fairly higher on than the ADP. What do you think about Ragans there? SP9 by AV, SP12 by recent ADP.
You don't happen to know who's ahead of him in ADP, do you? In that little range? As you look it up, this one surprises me. This one definitely surprises me. I think he's a top 10 starter, so I would expect to see him top 10 in both. So I'm Go ahead.
So going ahead of Ragans. I had that on. So Ragans is going behind Dylan Cease, Blake Snell, George Kirby, Corbin Burns, Jacob DeGrom, Chris Sale, Logan Gilbert.
Right. Yeah. Some of those are going. He's going ahead of some of those in auction. I think it's, some of those names are kind of high, maybe polarizing players. DeGrom and Sale for sure. Cease, maybe some of the uncertainty if he gets traded. That might be holding his AAV down. If he gets traded to a really good team, I mean, he's already on a good team, but if he gets traded to another good team, I think you might see a little boost there. I think Ragans will stay top 10 in AAV for sure, and he seems locked in as like a 25 plus auction buy, and I think if he makes it through the gauntlet of spring training as one of the healthy ones, I think that'll pop up to. I could see him going close to 30 as the auction season goes on. So I certainly have him in the top 10, and I have no problem with his AAV there. He's someone in that next tier that I think I'm definitely potentially interested in moving forward.
So Roki Sasaki. This is just a classic like gotta have him in an auction type of thing, right? Like I don't know, man. Like he's SP, what is it? SP 12 by AV. That's a lot, right? Or
Yes.
actually, yeah.
I mean, he projects out pretty well. I think he looks like maybe my second highest overpay pitcher in that like top 2025 range. So it seems a little irrational exuberance, 6-man rotation, that the Tommy John thing that came out, settling into a new league. I think there's a lot. There's some risk in the portfolio there. It's a sexy name. It's a great team. I get it. But I think maybe the ADP is just anchored by him not signing. I mean, I think everyone was kind of projecting it, but it wasn't like a sure thing. So maybe some of the early. Actually, this is the last 2 weeks, so that makes no sense. Sorry, I was starting to get into this back to the anchoring. So yeah, so the ADP is just as recent as the AAV. Yeah, so that's a pretty big split. That's a 6 SP split there, SP 18, SP 12. That's actually pretty big. That is interesting.
And then a couple other big splits here, and then we'll wrap it up. Joe Ryan, Hunter Brown going almost 10 SP spots higher by AAV than ADP. Joe Ryan, I think there's people that were worried about the shoulder injury at the end of the year. So there's some anchoring in ADP there. But the AAV crowd or the auctioneers not worried about Joe Ryan seemingly. And then Hunter Brown, I love Hunter Brown. I think I'd probably value maybe kind of in the middle of those two. But what do you think about those two?
Hunter Brown's getting a lot of hype. I'm hearing a lot of Hunter Brown talk. So I think that's just some hype that's pushing up the AAV. Again, it's a little more of a precise way to look at players. And I think that's that. The Joe Ryan one surprises me, not his AAV. That's kind of about where I have him, around SP 20. Hunter Brown, I have a little bit below 22, but not far. But at SP 30 and SP 31, those I should maybe jump into a DC. those seem like good prices for sure for those two. There must be. Yeah, I'm looking at my sheet. I can probably guess who's ahead of those guys. Maybe like the Graystons, the Bybes, the Peraltas, the Nolas. Maybe those are all going ahead of Ryan. I would guess.
Yeah. So Joe Ryan, going behind Bybee, Nola, Schwallenbach, Miller, Ober.
Yeah, that all makes sense. So yeah, maybe good buying opportunities in the DCs. I think in the auction, I think they're fairly priced right now.
Mark, any thoughts that we didn't get to that you want to unload here?
No, I think if you just want to just to be a completist and just finish up the our show sheet, just I think the relief pitcher is a little bit interesting, right? We have Devin Williams, RP5 by AAV, RP2 by ADP, and Miller is RP3 by AAV and RP5 by ADP. So that's interesting in the top 5, right? To have that kind of mix up. I'll put you on the spot. You have any thoughts on those two and why they're flip flop there?
Yeah, I definitely think there's a little bit of I could understand why the market would be more willing to treat Devin Williams like the no doubt like $22 guy or whatever, if his team hadn't just traded him. I think Mason Miller, just the fact that they're not going to stretch him out, I don't really think he's much more of an injury risk than the rest of these closers. So I'm with the AAV crowd there. I would take Miller over Williams. Like with Williams, he is just absolutely insane when he's on, but I just think he's a bigger missed time risk than Miller, is crazy it is to say at this point. So that's really kind of all I can judge these elite closers on, is like, do I think they're going to miss time, lose the job? What's the risk of that? I would take Miller as the safer of the two guys there.
Makes sense. And if I may, one more just with your upcoming auction. have you started prepping? Anything, any like big thing you're going to do different this year? I think you ended up cashing that league last year. We had that very interesting pitching staff. So that was a pretty, I think, good accomplishment against a lot of good players. So any early thoughts for you, or you haven't even gotten there yet?
Yeah, I'm kind of in the early stages of kind of getting a handle on things. I mean, it's great to talk to you, Mark, because you do things like a little bit differently than I do, and it's just really good to talk to people that do stuff just a little bit differently. And I think the biggest question for me is just sort of which starting pitchers do I buy? Like which 2 or 3 starting pitchers do I decide to really kind of build my team around? Which price ranges are those guys in? Like that's stuff I haven't decided yet. I assume I'll be among the lowest people in the league in dollars spent on pitching, but I like last year, Chris Sale saved me on that team. Luis Heel, you mentioned him. Like I got Luis Heel late in the reserves and Chris Sale as my SP1, and I ended up having better pitching on that team than hitting, where I spent like 72% on hitting or whatever. So I'll be doing that again. I just haven't decided which pitchers it's going to be yet. And then I want to have a few more options on the hitters as sort of second and third and fourth options when I miss out on my preferred options. Because for that first 500 DC auction that I did last year, like the biggest wake up call was just that all of the players I wanted, everyone else wanted, which you don't really experience it that starkly in a snake draft, where it's just like, all right, this guy's up that I definitely want. And then she's like, oh, he's already way past what I thought he was going to go for, So it's just kind of being more prepared to just miss on my first, second targets, that type of thing.
Yeah, sounds good. Let me know how it goes. Excited to see the team you build.
Yeah, I will definitely keep you posted on that. And appreciate everyone that hung around to the end. RotoWire Fantasy Baseball Podcast brought to you by Fantrax. Marc Winokur, amazing auction player and analyst. Love having you on, man. And thanks to everyone for listening. I'll be back next week.